Podcasting, I've learned, is a whole thing, right? It's a lot of work. It's really fulfilling when you have conversations that are just bullseye conversations, and everyone that you just mentioned, both I really saw as just outside of recording an interview together, right? They were people that it just seemed like an intersection where we're like, hey, the things that we're both passionate about, the things that we're up to, we need to talk and just encourage one another and learn from one another.
I appreciate you being here with me on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast. And likewise, I think we're here for the We Can Do This podcast too. But for folks who are unfamiliar with you and the work that you do, would you mind introducing our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, my name is Sean Pritzkau. I'm based here in Rochester, New York. I am the founder and host of We Can Do This, which is a podcast for social entrepreneurs as well, helping people inspire them and equip them and give them the tools to go out and either start or grow their own social enterprise or initiative. And in some of my other work, I work as a marketing consultant and an advisor. A lot of my background is in communications. And the podcast is really a way for me to kind of share some of my experience from my work, as well as bring on guests for people who are out there, doing the work and sharing about what they're up to, and hoping that inspires listeners. So yeah, really excited to be here.
I love it. And then let's start with that podcast, perhaps. What was the impetus for starting it, Sean?
Yeah, so I started my own freelance business or kind of consultancy about 5 years ago. And my desire and kind of the backstory of that was I did want to go out and make an impact out beyond my professional work that I was doing before, and got things started. And I found that I ended up working with like a real diverse client base. I was working with small businesses, solopreneurs, nonprofits, the whole gambit, really. And all along, I was really just saying, hey, this is good. I enjoy this work, but I really want to kind of fully dive into work that I feel is meaningful and is doing a larger work beyond just growing profit, right? Actually growing purpose. And so for years, I actually had thought about the podcast. We put together artwork, put together some concepts, and then there was someone, really, one of my best friends, who said, hey, go out and do it. Like, I know you want to do this. Just go and record your first episode right now. And I went over to the microphone and recorded the first episode. That was ended up being the show Open. And that was in April 1st, ironically, is when we launched. And no jokes. And yeah, the impetus it was really for, diving in and having conversations with like-minded people that were passionate about the projects that they were working on, the initiatives, and really taking like an innovative approach to business, as well as engaging their business with impact in mind.
I know we've shared a few guests now. Nivea Chanta with Soapbox, Brandon Harvey with Good,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe Dale Wilkinson as well. I'm curious what you're about. You have over 20 episodes out so far, right? What do you feel like are some learnings or understandings that you're taking with you thus far? Maybe into just generally the podcast production process, as well as the substance of the conversations that you're having with these folks.
Yeah, podcasting, I've learned, is a whole thing, right? It's a lot of work. It is. It's really fulfilling when you have like conversations that are just like bullseye conversations. And everyone that you just mentioned, both I really saw as just outside of recording an interview together, right? With just like, they were people that it just seemed like an intersection where we're like, hey, the things that we're both passionate about, the things that we're up to, there's just, we need to talk and just encourage one another and learn from one another. So, Brandon, Dale, Nivi, yourself really I feel really strongly about that. And ironically, everyone you just mentioned also has experience with podcasting. And so there's a lot to learn there, right? And I think, to be a podcast host, I think you have to be curious about other people's stories and other people's journeys and what they want to achieve. And so I think, having two podcast hosts talking to one another, I think is a really cool thing. And I think through those conversations, I just learned that, you can jump on someone's website or follow them on social media and see what they're up to. But it's really when you have this two-way dialogue that you see what is really motivating them. And you can really clearly see if they're motivated strictly by profit and growing a business or growing a brand or an image, or they're, truly want to use that as a vehicle to make a strong impact in the world and into the lives of other people. So yeah, I think through podcasting, I think I've only had a handful of solo episodes, which I like doing. I have a background in public speaking, but talking to a microphone is way different than talking to a room full of people. And so I think the conversations have been really, really encouraging and fulfilling for me. And I think from what I hear, other people enjoy kind of being a part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, I resonate with a lot you mentioned there. I think podcasting is a unique opportunity. It seems to like build something of a community in the space that you're part of, or even just want to be a part of. I mean, that was the inspiration for why I started this podcast over 3 years ago. It's funny. Likewise, I don't even think about the point in which, why I started it. Like my wife and I talk about this. She's like, it's incredible that you're 200 plus episodes in. I think right now as we're recording this, published like 205 or 6 or whatever. And she's like, that's really incredible.
It's unbelievable.
And it feels to me at this point, just because it's kind of like the water that you're swimming in, you don't really even notice it's the water around you so much. You're like, oh, I don't know. It is what it is at this point. And it's nice to remember that like, okay, that is something of accomplishment itself. It feels good. But at the same time, she's like, what actually inspired you or drove you to start? I was like, I don't know. Like, I don't even know. Outside of like, it was a vague curiosity first and foremost to like connect with this type of business community. First attending the conference for the certified B Corporation community, I felt a bit disillusioned with entrepreneurship and business in general after a previous experience I had. But attending this community, I like connected with a lot of business leaders, businesses where I was like, oh, these are more so my people who are using business as a tool. It's their vehicle for how they see their ability, their capacities best suited to make an impact in the world. So with that, it's like, all right, start reaching out to people who seem very active, engaged in this space to learn about what's just going on. But I'll share the same sentiment too. It's the more digging that you start to do, the more that you start to see the broad spectrum, of what it means to be, a social entrepreneur, if we want to use that word, a purpose-driven business, a sustainable business. These are all terms, and I get a bit obsessed with definitions because I think there's some value into it, at least to have the discussion around it. But there's a wide spectrum of really what that means. And we get pitched for podcast guests constantly for this podcast. I've now finally had to put on the contact page, like, we don't accept any pitches. Because I know for 99% of them, they're just kind of templated for the most part. But it's interesting you mentioned that, like the digging that you do when you really start to research who's out there, what kind of companies are out there. You can really see who is like walking the walk, as well. So that's just interesting to me that you share the same experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And just the thing that kind of stuck out to what you said is, you didn't know, like, it's hard to even tap into why you started. which I think is probably evidence that it's something that's just kind of really deep within you that kind of just comes out when you talk and engage in the world and do your work. And not to poke at any past experience, but you did mention kind of that there might have been a previous experience that may have left you a little bit disheartened or let down about maybe engaging in work that's not purpose driven or not purposeful, right? I think I know for sure I had a very an experience like that where I was going full on into another direction, and then really was kind of woke up and decided, hey, this isn't aligned with what I think I'm really created to do or kind of wired to do with this mindset of purpose. Yeah. But yeah, before the podcast, like what were you up to? And yeah.
Well, before starting Grow Ensemble and then the podcast, I worked for a digital marketing agency that served dental practices all over the US and Canada. So kind of an odd space to be in, but it was a full service digital marketing agency. And it was one of the reasons in which, I'm very grateful to have learned all the skill set that I've developed now, content marketing, digital marketing, just broadly speaking, but that the purpose behind that company was explicitly to make a profit, and so I got in kind of at the ground level of fourth employee there, and still very small business. It was a small business until the day that I was finished, but really kind of hustled and got this very close mentorship from one of the co-owners, an entrepreneur himself who made this promise, like, come work for me and I'll teach you everything I know about marketing, sales, and entrepreneurship generally. And so I, as at the time I was 19 years old, so I really kind of jumped at the opportunity. I was like, yeah, that sounds great. I always had an interest in entrepreneurship and thought that would ultimately be my path forward. And so a few years of mentoring very closely with him ultimately promoted me to the CEO position of his company after a couple of years. And so as the CEO of this marketing agency, still quite small, 25 employees, a couple $1 million in revenue a year. And I was in this position with still essentially the two owners being my bosses as the CEO. So they were sort of the board, I guess, in a very small business scenario. And there were a lot of these issues, a lot of personnel issues, one of which I was probably in a position without the proper leadership capacity and skill set. There's one thing to be said about just kind of jumping into it and learning as you go. There's another thing to be said that, maybe some experience is warranted. So I was 22 when I had that position. And, there's professionals with decades of experience who are, working, quote unquote, underneath me. And that caused some strain. It was difficult to really build good relationships in that way. And especially, every single day after that experience, reflecting on it, I was like, yeah, of course. Why the hell would people trust me to run that company? Yeah. But there was also issues with pay range, benefits that were available, just the work culture that was there, the work style. And getting into that position, I thought that I'd have a lot of strategic control and things like that of like, okay, this company, by all means, as far as small business was, even in doing at its peak when I was there, like $2.5 million, there's a lot of profit that runs in and out of a business like that. If it is quite successful and has really appropriate margins, a lot of money moves in and out of that, even for a business of just that size. Yeah. And so to have these conversations with people about like, hey, we're leaving because there's better pay here, there's benefits here. We're working really hard. We would love to continue working here, but I just can't, afford to work this way and support my family. And like looking at, they weren't wrong at all about, where pay and stuff ranged on what was, competitive in a market landscape. But the owners were a little hesitant to start making such drastic changes, and shifts. It's this feeling of where it really started to switch for me of like, the exchange that can happen in businesses or entrepreneurship generally, where there's almost this sense that like if you're not getting a good deal or if you're not taking complete advantage of someone else or something else in the situation, then you're not really doing enough. Like if you're not getting the most absolute work and effort out of someone for the lowest amount of compensation and pay or cost as they saw it, then, you're not doing it right. And I'm not saying that the owners were evil people. I think that they just have a much more conventional understanding of what business is for and what the purpose of it is. And so with limited sort of control of like, oh, I'd love to pay these people more. I'd love to let's get us all benefits, that kind of thing. But feeling like, whoa, there's some reins on me a little bit as to the degree to which I could affect and change those sorts of things, because they still had expectations of what sort of profit was going to be distributed into their personal bank accounts every quarter. And so I ended up resigning from the CEO position. The mentor I was very close to, I still have a good relationship with. He left. He didn't have a great relationship with the other co-owners. So there's a lot of kind of cultural issues and stuff there from the very beginning. But I left that, and I then had this very early existential crisis in my life of like, wow, I invested so much effort into learning digital marketing, sales, entrepreneurship. And I thought in that experience, it's like, is there a way in which it can be done ethical? Because it felt inherently and implicitly that was an unequal exchange, that there was like information that we were withholding from, staff members and team members, like, oh, they couldn't, it was a closed book, as far as the finances go. And that's put a whole different perspective on that as well, just kind of complete transparency as much as possible. But it's like there were things that were withheld for the sake of like, oh, if they knew that, then they wouldn't agree to work for us in the situation that they're working in, if that makes sense. And so I spent a lot of time walking the dog, drinking a lot of coffee, thinking about, what it was that I was to do next with my life. Kind of like, oh my God, because I dropped out of college ultimately to take that position at that company. So I really, burned the ships and jumped in with 2 feet. But my wife, who'd been familiar with social entrepreneurship for another reason, thought that I should check that out and recommended it to me. And so enough books and things, Google searches, I ultimately came across the Certified B Corporation community. And I found, in a month away from the point in which I was doing that search, they were hosting a conference in New Orleans, which is like an 8-hour drive from San Antonio. So reached out to the organizers. I was like, do you need any volunteers, for the conference? They said yes. Drove over. I have a cousin who was living there in med school, slept on her couch and went to this conference for a couple days, and had the opportunity to connect with folks who I'm close to this day, good friends with now, I work with now, which is very cool, who just really unlocked it for me that, there are different ways in which business can be done. So long answer to your question there, but that was the experience that really ultimately brought me around to, and I still question a lot of different ways, because the spectrum is still very wide in how to properly and ethically operate a supply chain, to employee compensation. There's a lot of these questions, and what I do enjoy is that businesses in this space and the business people behind it are very open to having those discussions, in that the way in which business has been done is perhaps not the way in which business should and can look like, or really what the core purpose of it is. But there's a lot of these things that we're still kind of wired to think about, in the sense of well, sustainability is something that is currently a market differentiator right now, as opposed to no, it's literally, the bare minimum. It should be the standard for us, being at the table, so to speak, especially given the context of if we're not doing that, then we are on a track, to complete climate devastation. So long-winded, I know, but I hope that gives you an inside look as to where I came from.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. It's so interesting to me, because I think, experiences like that frame the way that you see business, see the world, see operating with people. Employees aren't just employees; they're people, and so I think it's really, really important. And especially like you said, to take this specific role, you made life decisions that you can't go back and change, right? And once you kind of pour yourself into a specific thing, then there's costs that are associated with that, and I think that's kind of a little bit at the heart of, a purpose-driven business is, what are decisions that are worth spending the limited amount of time I have, on this on the planet, right? And do I want those decisions I make to be beneficial to others, towards the planet, towards communities? Do I want to make decisions that will leave on, sort of a legacy for others to follow and continue to move? I think that's really, really important. So yeah, it's I don't know if bittersweet's the right word, but it's those experiences, they really transform you, right? Like into what you're going to do for the next. You said you were 23, right? When you were in that role. So, by 30, by 40, like, you're a much different person than if you didn't have those experiences.
Certainly.
Right?
And it's like a matrix type thing of like, once you see it and come to this understanding that like, it can't, nothing, you can never go back to the way in which it was, and so similarly, to understand what's possible with business, or as well, I think just what kind of, from the negative lens of like what kind of exploitation is possible and is there, like you can't unsee that those things exist in the world, and that there are actual, while that was a small business and maybe the stakes seemed lower in some ways, it was, I don't know, we weren't working with people internationally or something like that. It's like there's still implications to that behavior on a much wider scale. It's like, if that's acceptable behavior in one business, it's acceptable behavior in the entire lens of the business community. And that's the thing that feels most frustrating at times to me, of like, it's weird the ways in which we feel comfortable with some of these levels of, one, exploitation or extraction, that it's like, oh, sustainability is a nice to have, equity is a nice to have, diversity is a nice to have, and if some sort of financial constraint, comes into contact with that, it's like, well, we have to make sure that the dollars and cents make, that have, those are appropriately aligned before we fully address the other things, as opposed to like thinking about it differently, which I do see business folks in this space do, to where, you can't compromise on the other, because there's some sort of belief that it's like, well, if a business can't address those particular components, then or very aggressively have plans in place to continue to improve, on those different markers, then perhaps they just shouldn't exist. Like, ultimately, that's the outcome. If they continue to operate unsustainably in one aspect of, people or planet, maybe ultimately they just shouldn't, have a license to operate, essentially.
Yeah. And then to your point of transparency, even if they're not necessarily, hitting the mark in every bucket, to know that there's a plan, and we want to communicate on behalf of the company, right? That, hey, we are halfway there, but not all the way there, and this is what we're doing to solve that, is really, really important.
Yeah, and those are things that you, as you mentioned in the research and digging deep too, like, often get questions of like, how am I supposed to know that a company is sustainable, or who I'm purchasing from? It's a company worth supporting. I'm like, well, just look at their website and see how much they tell you about the degree of how sustainable they are. Not in the sense of like, marketing, messaging, and communication, but like, what degree of documentation exists there? Like, I always bring up a friend of mine, Anders Ankerlid, with the company A Good Company, which is a sustainable e-commerce company based in Sweden. They literally have an interactive map with their supply chain of where they're getting raw materials from their products, photos of the factory, all that kind of stuff. Who are the people and accountabilities there to where those products that go, which factory, like it's extraordinarily detailed. They have like the designs of their products and everything laid out. For the sake of, what he believes, he's like, we're going to be sustainable from absolutely day one and be 100% transparent with the whole way through. So I really admire, and there's other great examples of that too, of people who show you their supply chain. They know the specific factories, they visit them frequently. They know what materials they're using, and there's definitely a different degree of transparency and documentation with that. But Sean, I'm curious to know, because this answer quite varies. Are there influences external, like friends or family or otherwise, outside of some of those earlier work experiences, that have made you be a bit more inclined to pursue work that has a greater purpose with it, something that ideally, leaves the world a better place than you found it? Like, I'm always interested to know what makes someone have an interest in pursuing this direction of work.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm inspired by a whole loads of people. Sometimes it's hard in the moment to think of who to bring up, but yeah. I mean, I heard this phrase the other day. You've probably heard it. This idea to follow your curiosity and not necessarily your passions. Heard someone bring this up, and I just think through, like, really my entire life, I was passionate about things, but I never knew, like, what, if I have to pick one thing, like, what is it that I am so passionate about that I want to make that a career, right? And I grew up in like a public school setting, and which I had a really good experience, but wasn't necessarily, exposed to the whole range of opportunities for your career, right? And specifically, like, entrepreneurship wasn't something that was really brought up. It just wasn't a traditional career path. And so I really struggled with thinking what I wanted to do for a career. And, my background is actually in ministry. So I had a lot of friends that grew up with like a faith background, religion. And I didn't really have that until like later in high school. And when I was exposed to religious community, I ended up, being part of like a evangelical megachurch for a while. And at that point, this was something that, it was the first thing that I was exposed to, that I was like, I think this is something that feels like I'm doing something beyond myself, that kind of thing. And decided to kind of like go 100% in that direction, and end up doing the undergrad degree, religion and philosophy, ended up doing a master's degree, and ended up working in a large, Christian megachurch as my career. And I think it was that experience that, I did see a lot of good things, but I also saw things that weren't aligned with what I thought was where I wanted to make an impact. Specifically, it was very surrounded by bringing people to like a specific place and communicating or talking at them in a certain way. And I really kind of, from my gut, and I think probably a lot of people can resonate, and maybe your audience, my audience, are people that usually listen to like their gut, like, what is it, how does this make me feel, and use that along with logic. And so my gut was saying, hey, I want to make, I think the impact I need to make is outside of the walls. And a lot of that was to my own like worldview shifting and changing over time, over 10 years and so. And so, I mean, my transition was really quick from that world. I think I resigned from my role I was on a communications team in a large church. And if you're familiar with that world, it's kind of like running an agency with, but all your clients are internal. So when you're hosting 3, 5, 10,000 person events, you have creative media teams that are really doing a lot of that work. And so I was in that role, resigned on a Friday, and then ended up on a plane to Haiti that following Monday. Just was invited on a trip that ended up being my first client. There was, kind of through a mutual friend. And I was honestly kind of turned off to the idea of Christian missions at that point. But I did see this organization that was doing a really good work in Haiti that was kind of essentially jumpstarting like entrepreneurship on the ground in Haiti. And it just opened my eyes to another way to do nonprofit work. And that really kind of opened my eyes to kind of how I can use my skills for good. That first project, we, in a relatively quick time, came up with a brand identity for this organization. We went down and did some documentary work in Haiti, and then ultimately did a fundraising event here. Ended up having 4,000 people come to an event. And it kind of opened my eyes to, I guess I have like some sort of skill set that is, valuable to folks that are looking to create change. And so that set me on a journey, I think, of saying, well, how can I empower more people to do good using the skill sets I have, and using, I know you have a background in marketing communications, right? And I think what we're seeing now is, modern nonprofits, you mentioned B Corps, for-profit companies that just have like a component of they want to see an impact made through their business or organization or through their profits, as well as just managing and running their business in an ethical way. I think just being exposed to these businesses and organizations that were out there doing business differently or doing nonprofit work differently. And some of those people were people in my life that I went to college with or were in family, but I just never understood it. It didn't click for me that the work that they were doing environmentally, the work that they were doing in serving underrepresented people groups and things, that it never clicked to me that was worth, dedicating your life to. And so I think I had those relationships all along. But there was my specific career journey experience that kind of wound, I found myself in a spot that is like, well, how do I make an impact? Who out there is making impact? And how can I jump in and use my skills for good? And I think I have a lot of, close friends, colleagues, people that are designers, videographers, creatives, who have that same desire to like make an impact with the creative skills that they have. And more, I think we're seeing opportunities for those people to use their skill sets for good.
And so in that sorting of, I love the inquiry, and this is something that's been ever present for me, especially over the last few years, of I like this baseline of I want to do something that like I want to use my skills, my energy, my capacity, the hours that I have here to ideally leave the world better off. Like, as whatever broadly that means. First kind of part of it is even figuring out like what exactly does that mean in different contexts and scenarios. You start to realize that you're like, oh, it makes sense that people dedicate their lives to very specific ways in impact, environmental, social, or otherwise, because it takes a lifetime to understand in some cases like what the world really needs, which is sometimes probably less than we have this impetus to get involved and take action. But I'm wondering for you, what does that process look like, that inquiry? How has it historically looked of like, how do you do that sorting? How have you figured out like where is the sweet spot of your skills, your interests, your curiosities, and where you can make an impact? And then following that, like, do you feel like you're in the sweet spot right now? Like, where do you feel on that journey of that personal inquiry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is. I think relationships are a huge part of it. There were specific people in my life who just through hearing their own experiences made me open my eyes to some injustice that's in the world. Specifically, like I was always in like diverse settings growing up. Like the church that I just mentioned was a diverse congregation. The school I grew up going to was extremely diverse, but never really understood the concept of racial injustice. And it wasn't through really, until I really developed close relationships with people that I could have conversations around race and dialogue around those things. And then learning to see like, okay, in my own workplace, how does that issue, how's that come up and how is it being dealt with? And then, I had a conversation over Zoom just, a year or two ago, someone asking, how are you taking steps in your own business and organization to make sure that you're creating opportunities for all people? And, those are hard questions that, from a level, like we just talked about transparency. It's like, what am I doing, to make sure that I'm creating opportunities for all people? So I think that's just one scenario or one example of, I think, relationships, looking at who's around you, what is in front of me, and how can I just be responsible with what I know, right? I think, like I said, like this idea of following your curiosity instead of your passions. I think the interesting thing about that is your curiosity changes. I think that's kind of like how I had this weird kind of career journey, and I think it's. I hope things change over the next 2, 5, 10 years, because I think that's evidence that my curiosity is growing and moving in different directions. So I'm excited that I'm specifically working and aiming to work with, organizations and businesses that are driven by purpose. But I hope, in the next 2, 5, 10 years that I can, even get more clarity around how can I make the best impact with my work. And that might be through further narrowing down the causes that I support, or the specific kinds of companies that I work with, or when it relates to the podcast, what are specific topics we're talking about, or how, what is beyond the podcast? Is it communities? Is it services? Is it, opposed to just having conversations around things, like what are ways that I can extend beyond those conversations and do concrete things that make an impact. I think talking about things is really, really good. But I think, acting and executing on some of these challenges are, that's even better.
Certainly. And it's, at least in my experience too, now having, a good few of these conversations over the last couple of years, it's been a balance of that, thinking about exactly where I can take action, but likewise thinking about like what's the greater community as a whole, the ecosystem of like who's very good. I think like Nivya Chanta as an example of someone we've already brought up and both had the pleasure to interview. She's so action oriented and like very specific, intangible actions that she can prescribe and work through with her community at Soapbox. So it's nice to start to think like, okay, my impact is not just constrained to myself and what Grow Ensemble can do and what this podcast can do, but like, who are some of the friends that I'm making here in this space, and what are some of their strengths and skill sets? And, that's just a good example for me, because not just, having conversations, we've started to figure out other ways her and I can collaborate together, and our communities and platforms can come together.
I love that.
I think it's funny that the way in which I would have answered that question that I asked you about how you're going through this inquiry, totally opposite. Like the first thing that you said, you're like, oh, it's the people and the relationships. And it kind of, my brain sort of misfired of like, my thought was like, he's going to say journaling and like, some deep introspection. Cause that's kind of like where I go. It's like, my wife and I will have conversations, and she's very like, she processes things audibly and verbally. And I'm like, hold on, I need to process this. I need to think through this. And our brains just don't, hers is working like 10 times the speed that mine is. Like, I just need the world to slow down to like go through those things, take experience in, meet people and connect with people. But it's so weird. Like I just don't process in the same way of like, I need a paper or whatever, pen and paper to sort that out. So it's just funny. Like I like the contrasting sort of approaches to that.
Yeah, I'm entirely a verbal processor, so I don't really know. I don't know what I think until I say it, like, and then I'm like, do I agree with what I just said? Let me go ahead and talk more about that. That's super, super interesting how we kind of like process these things. And I think, when it comes to like, how do you, let's say like you're a founder, right? And you want to nurture and grow the direction of your business, or really make sure it's in line with what you want to do. I think, with like a social enterprise or a business that's grounded in purpose, I mean, that own internal work is so important. Where I think of, I'm probably generalizing, but like, this traditional, often masculine idea of like corporate CEOs and things working 60, 80 hours a week and putting their personal life or their internal development, right? Whether that be personal or whatever, on the back burner. I think it's, caring for your soul, caring for your body, caring for yourself is extremely important, because that affects how you treat others and, lead your teams and all those kind of things.
100%. I think that baseline self-awareness is so key and helps you save a lot of hours and mistakes, of which, like, just, I think last year was there's a lot of experiments in the way in which I was determining how grow Ensemble, like what, we're 2 years in, what's trying to build the vision of what's the 5-year, 10-year trajectory, what sort of things can we sustain and do and, ultimately get better and better at over time. One of the things we experimented with was like actually launching a Grow Ensemble community, getting set up on Circle. Are you familiar with that community platform?
Absolutely.
And starting with some of the initial ideas and everything. And early on with the community, we did like pre-launch, all this kind of stuff. I realized just how that was just not in my sweet, like being a community manager and like kind of leading a community in that way is just like not my skill set at all. And Nivi keeps coming up here, and now I'm going to have to share this episode with her and make sure she listens. But that's why we ended up partnering with her in Soapbox and moved our, whatever kind of baby Grow Ensemble community that we started, merged it into Soapbox. And that's now I often recommend hers as a place to go. Nivi's very active. She's got a very good skill set for building an online community, with actually a capital C community attached to it, like a real sense of community, and that she's very good at it. So, with that is like, I had that as an idea that is just something that I could do for whatever reason. I was like, oh no, this is absolutely just not me, and not where I think that, if I have these desires to sustain what I'm doing and make an impact in doing so, it's not going to be in doing things that like I feel a lot of resistance towards personally, just what my aptitudes are and skill sets. And Grow Ensemble is not at a place to hire a community manager, full time. So, that would have been on me. But yeah, it's just, I think that self-awareness is really critical. And that's come up with, these hundreds of conversations I've had with other social entrepreneurs is likewise. It's like they really had to figure out, who they were, what their strengths were, as well their weaknesses, the shortcomings, and they either get partners or mentors or investors or, just strategic partners elsewhere to help them kind of account for the things that, they may not be too good at or just even like doing. Cause it's like, if we really want to, like, it's about the long-term trajectory of what you can sustain and what you can do, because first you got to get good at what you're doing, in our context here of podcasting, creating content and media. It's like, you have to do it for a long time, to really get an aptitude with it. Just inherently, you're not going to be good at it from the start. So if it's not something that, whatever it is that you feel like, very driven to do for a decade, I'm very into that kind of long-term thinking. Like, I just don't buy anybody. You're like, I'm going to do this for a few years, see, and then like either I'll sell off this business or whatever it is. It's like, just expect it's going to take a lot more effort and time, so hopefully, which is like the thing of, is it passions or curiosities or whatever that you follow? There's a whole bunch of different advice for that. It's like, you have to love it in one way. There's going to be crap in anything that you do. It's not always easy to podcast. It's like we blog, newsletter, all this kind of stuff. Those things aren't easy in a different way. And so you have to be willing to put up with the bad things of like, what is the pursuit that you're choosing? And I think, be able to sustain for the longest period of time, just like hanging around,
I like what you said, specifically about, really playing into your strengths and supporting other people and their strengths. That was sort of, in the initial thoughts of We Can Do This, was just seeing a lot of people working in silos and how if we actually did have dialogue with one another and learn that, hey, we're actually doing a lot of the same work, but I think we can make a bigger impact if we do it together in collaboration with one another in some fashion, and supporting one another, I think is really important. And can lead to more impact and less burnout, right?
Definitely.
If you're able to kind of, link arms with one another. One of the things that, I really wanted to ask you, because specifically in We Can Do This, there's a lot of people that, probably have an idea or are aspiring towards maybe working towards some sort of cause, or even maybe starting their own purpose-driven community or business. And at this point, I mean, you've been at Grow Ensemble for quite a while now, right? When did you start?
It's about 3.5 years. Yeah.
3.5. Yeah. So if you were, where you were 3.5 years ago with this idea in mind of, really starting and building a platform around social good, what would you tell yourself now, given the experiences you've had, the hundreds of interviews under your belt, really working towards this? Like, what would you say to someone who's in your shoes right now?
A lot of things, because a lot of mistakes have been made, most certainly. Yeah. But I think one would be probably to start sooner. I think that everything kind of happens at its appropriate time, but that's always the thing of like, probably to have just taken action sooner than I was comfortable with. I'm very much so someone who, my personality, I'm very in my head. I can get very existential and think like, I think too much, think myself into all sorts of problems. And so I get just an abundance of growth and value out of taking action, seeking meaningful experiences out. Like the conference is an example that I volunteered at, or any other coffees or anything that I've set up with people. COVID's a big asterisk on that, but doing those things that may feel a little bit, like, oh, I don't know if that even makes sense necessarily. It's like the conference, I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to get out of this, but I made relationships at that conference that, I'm working with those people right now, on very important collaborations and things for Grow Ensemble. And it was just so informative, and it really fueled what it was, my internal processing anyway. So to seek out those things and have that bias towards action as soon as you possibly can. And I think the thing that I really like in retrospect, things that I think were very good for me was to create some sense of public accountability to keep you to it, because it's not easy. And certainly as I'm sure you experienced, just, 20 episodes is a significant amount of episodes, to where there's been different periods of time where you're probably like, what, like, even though you may enjoy it, you're like, why am I doing this? Because in podcasting is kind of a black box, oddly, that like, you don't get a lot of analytics and data on who's listening, and who's engaging with the podcast. So there's periods where like, what am I doing this for? What is this actually leading to? Especially when like sustainability and perhaps the monetization of like, what makes this a business, in a way, how does that make sense? I'm glad that I've had the public accountability of publishing these episodes, starting to get some sort of sense of community around it. The people who I've interviewed who are like, hey, it's cool to see the growth of the podcast. And, I've been building a newsletter for the last few years of writing more detailed takeaways on that. It's like people expect things from me in some way. They're not going to be devastated maybe if it's not going to ruin their lives, but it's nice for me to know that like, there's some sort of public thing that people will be like, oh, what happened to the social entrepreneurship and innovation podcasts, And that took some time, because they're in those difficult moments. It was like, oh, I still have to put out a newsletter every Monday. I still have to put out a podcast every Tuesday. And not only that, there is still a little bit of like, well, it can't just be the same. I have to be getting better over time, just like incrementally, So I think that two of those things, both to take action and likewise, like the benefit of having some public accountability, and I will say support as well in there. It's not just about like holding your feet to the fire, but those were really valuable for me. And I think the third thing I would say is to be more patient with myself and do more of fewer things. And so, especially in the early days of any sort of idea or business, you want to do everything and anything to make it work, as opposed to paying attention to the few things that are working well and having the patience and discipline to be like, all right, whatever it is, I want to do X, Y, and Z, start a YouTube channel, whatever, as a means to grow I want to launch new products, or, I need to do trade show, whatever it is, the type of business you're starting. You think you have to do all of it at once, as opposed to it's okay to be like, no, I'm not going to do that right now. We can do that at some point, and trust that, investing deeper, both in the effort and just time to get better at the things that are going well for you. I think that will be a quicker path. And this is constantly, I constantly don't follow my own advice on this. I think I'm getting progressively better at it just by
100%.
Terrible mistakes that cost me a lot of time where I'm like, it comes back to the same lesson. I'm like, all right, when am I going to learn this? And I learn it a little bit more each time, I catch myself a bit sooner, but that would be the third thing, is to have that patience to focus more deeply on fewer things.
Yeah, it's an incredible response. I 100% agree with everything you just said. I think I'm a big fan of the 80-20 rule. And I think I saw that you referenced it in a recent newsletter. And, really following through with that takes some, really forces you to slow down. And if you don't slow down enough to really see hey, where the 20 or the 80% of the results coming from. And, for listeners, 80% or 20% of your work is usually leading to 80% of the results you're seeing. And if you don't slow down, especially you can do that first thing before you get busy. But if you're definitely like me, it takes 5-6 years to realize, hey, let me look back and see where are the results kicking in? Oh, it's on the 20% of the stuff that I do really well, or I really enjoy doing, or just necessary. Really important.
Absolutely. Well, Sean, I'm sure this will be the first of many conversations to come, but let's wrap this one up, and I'd like to do something a little bit different. So usually what I ask guests on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast are a couple rapid fire questions. Perhaps let's go through a couple, and I don't normally answer them myself, but I'll follow in answers after you. How does that sound?
Yeah, I love it. Let's do it.
So first one, what's maybe a book, or as well a film or something that you either always come back to or impacted you recently? Maybe something that you've been reading or something you watched recently that you'd like to share.
Yeah, it's my least favorite book is Essentialism, because if you're familiar with Essentialism by Greg McKeown, I think it's McKeown. It's asking this question of, if you can only do one thing, or you can only do a few things, what are those things, and how do you stop doing the things that don't fall in with those essential things? I joke around, but I hate the book so much because it leads me to make decisions I don't really want to make, but I should make. What are things that are occupying my time, but are leading me to say no by my actions, right? If I'm saying yes to one thing, I'm saying no to another. That book it's like a challenging read for me, and I try to pick it up once a year because it leads me to make decisions that are ultimately healthy. What about you?
I like that one. Well, I'll share this book that I have on my desk right now for people watching on video, How to Take Smart Notes. So this book is basically breaking down the workflow of this German sociologist, lived in the early mid 1900s, of having this incredible workflow for producing nonfiction writing. Who's an academic, and another professor is breaking down what he did and how he consumed and retained information to produce such hundreds of articles over his career, 40 some books over his career. It's felt more important for me just because what I've come to realize over the course of doing this podcast and the work with Grow Ensemble is that I come across so much information, and it's where I want to be. I absolutely love just learning and taking in information. Sometimes I don't do anything with it. I just have that fascination with I learned an interesting thing, and someone's like, so what? I'm like, oh yeah, I guess it doesn't, have the same experience for everyone else. But building out a good workflow, both in the sense of what I learned from the podcasts and what sort of research and stuff comes out of that. Cause I really see the podcast as, both an opportunity to build community, both with the folks on the show and listening to the show, but I consider it research for what are some of the hypotheses and things that I'm working through my own head in the space of sustainability and social impact. So to help myself, increase the ratio of consumption to output, writing, publishing, and all, video, audio, text, I really like what this book is saying as to how to digest it. I won't dig into the substance. That's not what this conversation's for. But it's been a really good book for anyone who comes across a lot of information in their lives for one way or another, and has an interest in publishing more, whatever that might be, podcasting, writing, or even, video. So I've really enjoyed that one.
Oh, that's great.
Next question for you, Sean. What's a daily routine or daily habit that you absolutely, or morning routine that you absolutely have to stick to, if any?
That's good. I'm there's a book, I'm trying to remember that I read a while ago that is about routines and the idea of creating like a morning routine and or a morning ritual, I think, and an evening ritual, and then like a workday startup routine and a workday shutdown routine. So I try my best to do these. I guess if I was to pick one thing in the morning, I mean, I'm obsessive with coffee. Like
I've seen photos I think on your Twitter.
A big into coffee. Some of my best friends are coffee roasters. So it's almost like a hobby. So I start every day with coffee, for sure. Probably one of the things that is more of an aspirational thing. I don't stick to as much as I want, but just like not checking my phone first thing in the morning. A few years ago, I made the decision to put my phone across the room. And I think this is Matt Diavella. I think that this is a tip I heard from him, but to put your phone across the room and to put a glass of water there. So every morning you have to literally get up, shut off your alarm, and then drink a glass of water. And then that kind of like gets you up, wakes you up. If you crawl back into bed, you probably will have to get up pretty soon to go to the bathroom. But yeah, that idea of just like not having my phone be near the bed, my anxiety doesn't creep in, and then I roll over and check an email or check a to-do list for the next day. It just kind of separates, my phone from my mind and allows sleep and rest to be sleep and rest. And then I try not to check, the incoming messages and things until I sit down at the desk and time to work and actually time to consider those things. I don't always follow through with it because like the temptation is pretty big. And when you pick up your phone, even for an alarm, to see things swipe across that are important. But when I do follow through with that, I find it valuable for my own mental health.
I'm with you. And that's definitely been something that I've tried to adopt myself. Likewise, it's easier said than done. It seems like kind of the greater that you build the resistance into actually messing with it and checking with it, the easier it is. But I'm with you on that 100%.
Nice.
I guess for me, there's a smattering things. I like to do some journaling. Of course, coffee is a big part of it for me too, reading. But all those things are not necessarily stuff that like I can commit and do every single day the exact same way. I think the number one thing for me is that my wife and I take the dogs to the park and throw the ball for them. They're big on fetch. So it's this routine. It's like no matter where we are, no matter where we wake up, we go to the park. And like whether we're back home or in Washington visiting my family, it's a nice routine. It gets us outside. We're here in Boston and like there's 4 feet of snow or whatever, like last weekend. Went and did it. Lost a whole bunch of tennis balls because the dogs lost them. But there's something about it that we absolutely have to stick to. It's just a nice, thing that we do together, and good for the dogs. Makes us feel like better dog owners for whatever reason. But yeah,
I love that. And I could. We do a similar thing. Like we'll bring our dogs to the park most every day to get energy out. And my favorite thing is it's like utterly unproductive in the grand scheme of things. Like when you think of work. So to really start your day with something that is not, hey, I'm pushing some thing forward, it's just purely out of care for your dog, enjoying being with your family in the outdoors. That's awesome.
Awesome. Well, Sean, I really, really appreciate the time. Last one for us, which should be easy. Where's the best place for folks to keep up with you and the We Can Do This podcast? Where should they go check out?
Yeah. So the podcast is I strive to do a weekly show. So if you like podcasts, like listening to folks talk about what they're working on or what inspires them, then yeah, the best place is to hopefully see me once a week over there. And then I'm active online, but primarily Twitter is where I try to uh, be active, listen, have conversations with people. I found that's one of the most beneficial places to meet people online right now too. So if you do stop over, make sure to say hey, and I'd love to connect.
Yeah, that's where we connected as well. I think there's a lot of good reasoning for that. And then for folks on our end, if they're curious in checking out the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast, we have our full archive at socialentrpreneurship.fm, which is a new website we launched this year. And then all things Grow Ensemble, our newsletter, all that good stuff is at growensemble.com. And likewise, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter decently. So, all right, Sean. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time and getting this opportunity to chat.
Yeah, it was really great talking with you. I really enjoyed chatting. And yeah, again, folks listening today, and we can do this, definitely go out and check out Grow Ensemble. Go say hello to Cory on Twitter. And yeah, it was really great chatting today.